In the quiet village of Odimba, where the red dust clung to every roof, and the wind carried both the scent of harvest and whispered judgment, there was a girl named Amara, whom almost everyone had already decided was useless before she had even truly begun to live. She was the orphan who spoke too softly, who walked with her head slightly bowed, who spent more time watching the sky than working in the fields the way others did. In a place where strength was measured by how loudly one could be heard and how much one could carry, Amara seemed like a mistake the village tolerated rather than accepted. The women at the well muttered when she passed, the men shook their heads when she asked questions, and even the children, who were supposed to know nothing of cruelty, repeated what they heard. Useless, slow, forgotten. Yet there was something they did not see, something even Amara herself did not fully understand at first. She noticed patterns others ignored. She listened to the river at night as if it were speaking in a language only she could faintly understand. She observed how the wind changed before storms came, how the birds abandoned the mango trees before sickness spread through the crops. And still no one cared, until the day everything began to break. Not one, not two, but many of them fell sick after playing near the old valley beyond the village boundary, a place elders warned against but never explained. Their fevers rose too quickly, their eyes turning glassy, their mothers crying out into the night, while the healers shook their heads in confusion. Panic spread like fire through dry grass. The village chief, a stern man named Obasi, called for answers, but none came. And in the midst of that rising fear, Amara stood quietly at the edge of the gathering crowd and said something so soft that at first it seemed like it might have been the wind itself. It is not the valley that is sick, it is what was brought into it. The crowd turned. Laughter came first, sharp and dismissive. Who was she to speak in such a moment? But the children kept falling ill, and fear has a way of weakening pride. As the days passed and the healers failed, the village began to remember the things they had once mocked about her habit of watching the soil, her strange insistence on avoiding certain water sources, her silence that felt less like emptiness and more like listening. Reluctantly, Chief Obasi sent for her, not because he believed in her, but because disbelief had already failed them too many times. When she arrived before him, barefoot and calm, she did not bow as expected, and that alone caused murmurs. "You said you know something," he said, voice heavy with exhaustion and pride resisting collapse. Amara looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing not just her answer, but the weight of what truth does when it is finally spoken aloud. "The valley is not cursed," she said. "Someone is using it." Silence fell so quickly it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. And then came the beginning of the unraveling. She asked for permission to go to the valley at dawn, and against all expectations, perhaps because desperation erodes authority faster than rebellion ever could. The chief agreed, though he sent 2 men to follow her in secret. At dawn, when the village was still half asleep and wrapped in a fog that clung to the ground like memory, Amara walked toward the valley. The air grew heavier the closer they came, the birds fewer, the plants strangely discolored. She knelt by the soil and pressed her fingers into it, and what she felt made her close her eyes. not sickness from nature, but contamination placed deliberately. Foreign substances buried beneath the earth, slow-acting, spreading through roots and water. Someone had poisoned the land. Behind her, one of the men scoffed, but the other said nothing, watching her with unease. Then Amara stood and followed a faint trail. Only she seemed able to notice a pattern of disturbed earth hidden beneath fallen leaves. It led them not deeper into wilderness, but toward something far more unsettling. An abandoned structure near the edge of the valley that should have been empty, but was not. From inside came faint movement voices. Dozens of them, marked with symbols no one in the village used. The men behind her froze, but Amara stepped closer, her heart beating not with fear but recognition. This was not random. Meanwhile, back in the village, the children's condition worsened. Mothers began to accuse one another. Elders argued, and trust cracked like dry wood under pressure. And in that chaos, a second truth was forming, one that no one yet wanted to accept. Someone from within was benefiting from the sickness. Amara returned with her discovery, but instead of gratitude, she was met with suspicion, sharpened by fear. "You went alone?" one elder asked. "And returned unharmed?" whispered another. Only Chief Obasi listened fully, his expression tightening as she described the barrels, the markings, the hidden trail. He sent guards to investigate, but before they could act, something changed. The men who had followed Amara secretly returned early, pale and shaken, and requested to speak only to the chief. What he revealed turned the story in a direction no one expected. The barrels were not just poison. They were connected to trade routes the village had unknowingly been entangled in for years, routes controlled by outsiders who used remote communities as testing grounds for agricultural manipulation. And worse, there were signs that someone inside Odimba had been communicating with them, someone with access, someone trusted. The village began to turn inward, suspicion now replacing fear. And Amara, once mocked as useless, became something else in their eyes, either their only hope or their greatest threat. The truth, however, was still deeper than anyone understood. On the third night after the discovery, Amara did not sleep. She followed a memory she could not explain, something she had seen long ago when she was still small and her parents were alive. A man entering the chief's compound at night, carrying sealed crates. A conversation cut short when she was noticed. Back then, she was dismissed as a child imagining shadows. Now, she walked toward those shadows willingly. And what she found there changed everything. Inside a hidden chamber beneath the chief's storage hut were records, agreements, and correspondence. Proof that the contamination of the valley had not only been known, but partially enabled in exchange for wealth and influence that never fully reached the village people. Chief Obasi was not the savior they believed him to be. He was not the enemy either, in the simple way stories prefer. He was something more dangerous, a man who believed sacrifice was justified if it preserved order, even if that order was built on silent suffering. When Amara confronted him, there was no shouting at first, only silence thick enough to fracture the soul. "You were never useless," he said finally, voice low, almost breaking. "You were inconvenient." And in that moment, Amara understood that the real battle was not just for the children, or the valley, or even the troop. It was for the soul of the village itself, for whether it would continue to survive on buried harm or finally face what it had become. The confrontation that followed did not erupt in violence. The chief tried to justify, to explain the years of compromise, the pressures from outside forces, the belief that small sacrifices prevented larger destruction. But Amara's voice, though still soft, no longer carried hesitation. "A village that survives by poisoning its own roots does not survive at all," she said. Word spread quickly. The elders gathered. The people demanded answers. They were no longer willing to avoid. And for the first time, Obasi was not speaking to a crowd that feared him, but one that saw him clearly. The alliance with the outsiders was exposed. The contaminated valley was sealed. The sick children began slowly to recover as treatment arrived from beyond the village, through channels Amara herself insisted on opening, refusing to let pride block help even after betrayal. And when the dust finally settled, no one called her useless again. But she did not become their hero in the way songs often pretend. She remained something more unsettling and more important. That truth often looks like silence before it becomes unbearable. That the overlooked are often the ones who see first. And that survival without honesty. In the final gathering at the village square, as the sun dipped low and the wind moved gently through the restored fields, Chief Obasi stood before the people, not as a ruler, but as a man stripped of illusion. Amara stood among them, not above, not below, simply present. And as the village began to rebuild what it had nearly lost, a question lingered in every mind, unspoken but alive. How many other voices had they dismissed that might have saved them sooner? And if the answer was more than one, then what else had they already lost without ever noticing? The village of Odimba tried to return to normal, but normal no longer felt innocent. The children were recovering slowly, yet the fear that had entered every household did not leave with the fever. People now looked at the valley differently, as if it might still be watching them back. And more dangerously, they began looking at each other the same way. Whispers replaced conversation. Eyes lingered too long on those who once moved freely through the village without suspicion. She was no longer ignored. She was observed. Every step she took now carried weight in the minds of others, as if even her silence could be evidence of something hidden. Chief Obasi, once unquestioned, now spoke less in public, his authority dulled not by removal, but by doubt that clung to him like dust after a storm. Yet even as tension tightened across Odimba, something deeper was forming beneath the surface. Amara could feel it in the way certain elders avoided her gaze, in the way the guards changed their routes at night, in the way the air itself seemed heavier near the chief's compound. The discovery in the valley had not ended anything. It had only opened a door no one was ready to close or fully walk through. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the palm trees and stretched long shadows across the paths, Amara was approached by Nkim, one of the few villagers who had once quietly shown her kindness. Dinkim's voice trembled as she spoke. "They are saying the chief did not act alone," she whispered. "They are saying there were meetings before the sickness began. Amara did not respond immediately. She already suspected this, but hearing it spoken aloud made it heavier. "Who else?" she asked simply. Nenkem shook her head. "No one says names. Not yet. But they are watching the old storage huts again. And the night guards, they are being replaced." That night, Amara did not return home. She moved instead toward the outskirts where memory itself felt buried under years of silence. The same path she had taken before now felt different, as if the land remembered what had been revealed and no longer wished to hide it. Near the abandoned structure she had discovered earlier, she found something new. Fresh footprints, recent activity, and the faint sound of movement inside. But this time she did not enter immediately. And in that waiting, she understood something important. The village was not just recovering from harm. It was actively deciding what truth it was willing to accept. Inside the structure, voices rose. Briefly then fell silent as if responding to an unspoken warning. Amara stepped back into the shadows, realizing that what was coming next would not be about discovery alone. It would be about confrontation, and someone, somewhere in the village, already knew she was getting closer to the truth they had tried to bury. The final fracture in Odimba did not come with noise, but with silence that felt too intentional to be peaceful. 2 nights after Amara's visit to the outskirts, the village awoke to find the chief's compound surrounded by guards who did not belong to them. Outsiders, their presence confirmed everything that had only been whispered before. The agreements, the valley, the sickness, all of it was part of something larger than Odimba had ever imagined. Fear returned, but this time it had direction. It was no longer confusion. It was realization. Not as a girl this time, but as a witness. When she entered the compound, Chief Obasi looked older than before, as if the weight of every decision had finally become visible on his skin. The documents she had uncovered were already on the table between them, opened like wounds that could no longer be hidden. "You think this is betrayal," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "But you do not understand what happens to small villages when larger powers decide they are in the way." Amara did not step back. "Then explain why it was children. Who suffered first?" That question hung in the air longer than anything else. Outside, the village gathered. Word had spread too quickly for containment. People stood at a distance from the compound, watching, waiting, no longer willing to accept silence as an answer. Inside, Abasi finally spoke the truth without layers of justification. The village had been monitored, and the sickness was part of a trial that had gone wrong. Something meant to be contained elsewhere, but redirected through Odimba because it was quiet enough to risk. When the doors opened and the truth spilled into the open air, nothing dramatic happened at first. No shouting, no collapse, only stillness. Then slowly voices rose, not in defense of Obasi, but in disbelief that their lives had been treated as expendable. The outsiders were forced to withdraw under pressure from regional authorities, alerted by the exposure. Amara insisted upon sending beyond the village. The compounds were dismantled. The valley was sealed and later cleaned under supervision. And the children, once forgotten in the logic of distant decisions, were given care that finally matched their suffering. When it was over, no victory celebration followed. There was only the quiet aftermath of a place learning what it meant to have survived, something it should never have endured. Obasi stepped down, not in dramatic downfall, but in exhausted surrender. And Amara, once called useless, stood at the edge of the rebuilt fields as the wind moved through the crops that would now grow without poison beneath them. No one crowned her, no one needed to. But as the village returned to its rhythm, slower now, more careful, a new understanding remained in every glance exchanged and every silence kept. What they had once dismissed had been the only thing strong enough to save them